Welcome to a new episode of Minds Between Languages. Our guest today is Professor Silvia Hansen-Schirra, a translation scholar working at the interface of corpus studies and experimental cognitive approaches. Together, we will discuss one of our main areas of expertise, translation universals. Alright, welcome everybody, and thank you very much, Silvia, for joining this space. It's wonderful to have you here to talk a little bit about universals in translation, right? So first of all, how are you and how has this quarantine been treating you so far?
Yeah, thank you so much, Adolfo, for the invitation. I'm fine and I'm looking forward to the interview.
Fantastic. So let's start with a basic question. What is a universal in translation?
Well, a universal in translation is a feature or a pattern which is typical of translated text in contrast to non-translated text. And this is irrespective of the language pair, the language direction, the translator, the text type. It is irrespective whether it is a near or distant language pair. So it happens all the time in translations.
Okay, so but that answer you just gave me, maybe I could extrapolate it to culture-specific matters too. What is it about these features that make them universal and that perhaps separate them from other types of features that are not universal?
Well, let's start from the other way around. What is a language-specific feature? A language-specific feature can be, for example, or what is a language pair-specific feature? I should put it this way. A language pair-specific feature could be due to contrastive differences, for example. If you take, for example, English-German, we have a lot of nominalizations in German. So a language pair-specific feature would be nominalizing constructions from English into German. Or another example would be non-agentive subjects. It's quite typical to have non-agentive subjects such as this hotel forbids dogs in English. That's quite typical. We don't have them that frequently in German, so it would be a typical translation strategy to avoid them into German.
All right. Now, that's very clear. My question is, how do you go about researching this? And without venturing into the cognitive domain just now, how is this typically done in the field? How do you go about identifying what is a universal feature, what is not a universal feature? How has this been done traditionally, first of all?
Yeah, one of my most important inspirations has been Mona Baker. Mona Baker started out with doing this kind of research, and she collected a big translation corpus, the translational English corpus, TEC, and she compared this corpus with non-translated English text. So this is basically the answer. The traditional way of investigating universals would be a corpus-based, a quantitative corpus-based way.
Okay, so could you give us a little bit more detail there? So you have your corpus, and I understand it's at least a bilingual corpus, right? I mean, with the source and target texts paired and aligned, or how does it actually work?
Yeah, it's not necessarily bilingual.
All right.
The TEC corpus, Mona Baker, started out with English translations only. And she collected translations from several source languages. So they could be French English translations, German English translations, Arabic English translations, and so on. And she didn't use the source text at all. So she compared the English translations with English non-translated text in order to find out what makes which features are typical of the translated text, which do not occur or do not as frequently occur in non-translated text. So that was the basic idea behind that. Yeah, there are several problems. Maybe I can go on with the problems because
please
you
do.
mentioned.
We love problems. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, that's a very problem-oriented interview, I suppose. No, I will tell you about something about the solutions later on. For example, let's discuss the universal feature of explicitation. Mona Baker formulated the hypothesis that translated text is more explicit than non-translated text. And she investigated the optional that in English. Yeah? So she said, in English translation, it will be more frequent to use the optional that. For instance, in sentences such as, he said he is ill, he said that he is ill. And the latter occurs in translations. The first one without the optional that rather occurs in non-translated text. And then she counted the instances of the that connector and the zero connector and compared both. The problem here, again from the German-English point of view, is that the that is not optional in German. It has to be there. So if there is the optional that in English translations translated from German, it might not be a processing strategy. It just may be a literal translation from German into English.
Right.
So it's quite difficult to say something about this universal feature explicitation without looking at the source text. So here my solution would be, yes, please, let's also collect the source texts and compare English translations to non-translated texts in English, but also let's have a look at the source texts.
Right. That's very clear. So right now, would you say that the field has moved towards a more bilingual approach to corpus studies, or is the unilingual, let's say, target text exclusive approach still mainstream?
Well, I think there are a lot of initiatives which are bilingual or even multilingual, including several language pairs and language directions. For example, if we have a look at the translation process research database, here we have English source texts which are translated in several target languages. So we have a multilingual translation corpus, and we can compare translation strategies across language pairs, which is nice to have. Yes, so I would say that this idea to investigate parallel texts, aligned texts, is becoming more and more important in translation studies, in corpus-based translation studies. Yes.
Fantastic. And something that makes you very interesting. There are many things that make you interesting, Silvia. This is not just because we are friends, you know. One of those things is that you have this interest and this expertise in studying universals, which is something that has been traditionally been done in this, let's say, you know, corpus-based approach. Let's call it that, right? But at the same time, you have an interest and a full-blown line of research, which is cognitively oriented. And not only cognitively oriented, you also work from a neurocognitive stance. So I'm interested in that intersection. How do you go about combining these two worlds? And what's the difference between studying universals in the typical classical corpus-based approach and doing it from a cognitive stance, if there is any such difference?
Yeah, there is a difference. In corpus-based translation studies, it's all about quantitative patterns and the comparison between subcorpora. In cognitive science, well, cognitive processing very much depends on the participant of the study, on the translator, and you've just mentioned it, on his or her level of expertise, on the text type he or she has to translate, on the modes of translation, whether it is written or oral translation, which means translation or interpreting or side translation or subtitling. Yeah, and the difference is also, or the difficulty is that it's really hard to correlate cognitive processing with text-based universals. So even if we can find cognitive universal processing, they may not be directly correlated to what we find in the output in the translated text. And
so let me see if I get this straight, right? So in the typical approach, basically you're working on translation products, yeah? Translated texts, sometimes vis-a-vis non-translated texts in the same language, sometimes vis-a-vis the source texts, yeah, in whichever language they were first produced. Now here, from a cognitive stance, you're not working on focusing on the product, but rather on the process, yeah, on some collection of processes, right? So when you say that you're trying to make links between one dimension and the other, does it mean that you are looking at the processes of the same people who produce the products you're looking at, or do you have the products from a given corpus and then you look at processes from another collection of people who may not have participated in the production of the translated texts proper, right?
In fact, we do both. We investigate translation corpora, where we do not have the chance to interview the translators or to involve them in experiments. So we only have the quantitative view, the quantitative perspective. In these cases, we sometimes rebuild experiments in order to somehow simulate the processes which were going on when the texts were translated. On the other hand, we have text corpora, where we also have the behavioral data of the translators. I mentioned earlier, the translation process research database, the TPRDB. And here we have parallel corpora, source text and target text. And we have key logging, eye tracking, interview data of exactly these processes where the corpora resulted from.
Right. And okay, so I think you gave us very good examples of what universal is as manifested in the texts, in the products proper, right? Now, could you give us an example of a universal process? Is there something that you could give us in terms of cognitive or maybe even psychobiological or neurocognitive processes that may amount to a universal from a process stance, right?
Yeah, some universal processes which are quite well researched in translation studies are probably priming and monitoring processes. So priming, when the translator is primed by a certain structure, by a certain lexical item, and monitoring in these, which occurs in these cases where, the language, the output needs to be monitored. But here we are speaking about unconscious processes. It's not conscious monitoring. I do not speak of editing processes in this case.
Right. Now, when you say prime, and this is a very typical construct in cognitive science, what you mean is that maybe there are some structures which, let's say, predispose the translator to engaging in certain processes or even favoring certain, let's say, target text or target language candidates over others. Is this how you are conceiving of this notion?
Exactly. In my lab, one of my PhD students, Katharina Oster, worked on cognates and the priming effects on cognates. For example, the English word system can be translated by the English word System, by the German word System, but there are also many other alternatives which we can use. And it's quite interesting to see when the translator chooses one alternative over the other. So, and of course, priming here plays a very important role.
Definitely. So the idea would be that when you have a cognate, let's say words which in the source and the target language share a significant amount of phonological or orthographic information, right? Let's put it even simpler, right? They're typically spelled and pronounced in rather similar ways between languages, right? So the idea is that the fact that you are already pre-activating some of that shared phonological information makes it easier to access the target word which shares that information. Something like that, right?
Exactly. There's some kind of co-activation which is going on in the mental lexicon, which makes the primed solution more probable than the others. Yeah.
Now, you know, something that has always intrigued me about universalist approaches to cognition or research in general is that it seems to be a term that is always underdetermined by the data, in the sense that right now there are approximately some 7,000 living languages in the world. Yeah, in a very disproportionate with a disproportionate distribution of speakers. Right, there are some so-called world languages, and there is minority languages, but let's say, you know, some 7,000 seems to be the consensus nowadays. Now, for something to be universal, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but the presumption is that this would hold across all languages and all language pairs, all possible language combinations. However, when you take a look at the literature, and this is not a problem that befalls translation and interpreting studies only, it's the same problem that faces cognitive science, neuroscience, behavioral science. The truth is that only a handful of those languages have actually been researched. And we are really talking about a handful. I mean, if you really want to be indulgent, you would say maybe something like 100 languages have been researched. And it's not even that, right? But how do you manage this tension between trying to find something that is supposed to cut across all languages when you actually have access to only very few of them for actual research?
Yeah, that's in fact an unsolvable problem, and I will take this research question with me until I will be retired, I suppose. Well, I'm a networker. Maybe I can have more international corporations where we build up large data sets of process and product data and compare the translations and the behavioral data. But you are completely right. I think it's a quite, it's a theoretical question, and I think it will be not possible to investigate universals. Therefore, I like to call them universal hypotheses. So they are interesting features in language and in translation because we suppose that they might happen in each and every translation situation. But I suppose that we will not be able to investigate it in a completely comprehensive way.
But still, there may be a middle ground, right? Because maybe you do find patterns that are systematic, robust, consistent across languages which perhaps belong to the same family or which have some typologically resemblance or some way of grouping. And so, I mean, between the language specific and the full-blown universal, there's a middle ground of subgroupings, right? Maybe that is let's say, a reasonable way of reorienting or at least constraining the findings in this field, right?
Yeah, right. And it's interesting to find strategies or patterns which exist in near language pairs as well as in distant language pairs. So this might be another kind of middle way. Another very interesting approach is to investigate mental processes which are not exclusively located in the language area of the brain. So for example, the monitoring processes. I mean, monitoring happens all the time when I am in the car or when I don't know, each and every cognitive process is monitored. So it's a rather language independent process. And this might also be a candidate for universal processing, which I find quite interesting.
Right. Now, you are applying a number of behavioral and neurocognitive techniques to explore these issues. One of them is EEG, right? Electroencephalography, in particular, event-related potentials, right? It's one of the main tools that you are using at Traco, at your lab, right?
Exactly.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you are using EEG, basically, applying a collection of electrodes on the scalp to measure electrical brain activity? How do we go from that, right? From measuring electrical brain activity to exploring universals in translation?
Oh my God, I think we need a couple of days to, to explain that comprehensively. I don't want to go into too many details here. The interesting thing here is that we do not work with whole texts. So in order to find event-related potentials, which means electric potentials in the brain, which are active during language processing, we need very clear experimental settings. And we typically do this with single word experiments.
Right.
Or right now we are setting up an experiment with sentences, but that's quite difficult because these kind of measurements are highly time oriented, and we do it when we work with sentence-based stimuli. We put the stimuli at the very end of the sentence in order to identify them clearly.
Right.
So that's, and then we compare a stimulus against a control word or a control sentence.
Right.
And by doing this, we can trigger the event-related potentials.
Right.
And we can clearly correlate the results with the stimulus. So that's the important thing to do. However, when I present...
ideally, going back to your networking claim before, maybe one way of bridging both worlds would be to have the same experiment, culturally and linguistically validated across different languages, and maybe, having a multi-centric experiment, at least covering a handful of languages, right? That would be one way of bringing both worlds together, I think.
Exactly, that would be perfect, to have a database of ERP data with possibly very similar stimuli, or a very similar set of stimuli, and which we can compare across translation settings and across language pairs. Yeah. The problem, however, with this kind of research is that translation scholars at conferences always tell me that we do not translate single words. So there is a trade-off between ecological validity, which means authentic translation settings, translating whole texts, of course, and experimental or statistical robustness. So this trade-off somehow has to be resolved. And our solution here is to solve, or to use mixed method approaches. So we use single word or sentence-based EEG experiments and complement them, or add some corpus-based stuff or some other behavioral experiments, for example, eye tracking experiments, key logging experiments, in order to level out the disadvantages of the several approaches.
Right. Well, speaking about topics that would deserve a whole appendix, right? This will be one of them, but
exactly.
We will set that one aside for another talk. I'm wondering about the implications of this line of research, right? So you are combining, this mixed method approach, which is so rich in itself, going from corpora to behavioral measures to neurophysiological measures. And I think that we can appreciate the methodological, the empirical, even the theoretical contributions that this may have. But what are the implications, what are the benefits that could be derived from this line of research for teaching, perhaps, or the training of translators?
Yeah, interfacing, for example, written and oral translations gives insights into several modes which we use in our training and education settings. For example, subtitling. So our research may shed some light on universals of subtitling or efficient strategies of subtitling, for instance.
Okay.
On the other hand, it would be nice, I mean, machine translation is a big issue in our discipline. It would be nice to compare, well, universal features of translation or typical features of translation across languages to universals of machine translation. And this would, this would result maybe in post-editing strategies, which may be very efficient for our students or for practical applications. Another implication I am thinking about is, for example, defining patterns of quality. And here, I do not only speak of product quality, but also process quality. What does process quality means? And I mean, this very much goes hand in hand with the development of competences, of course.
Right. I was going to ask you about what you believe are the main challenges for the field. I think you may have touched on some of them, but are there any other main, what's the next big thing? What's the next big issue that needs to be addressed in this field?
Yeah, one of the challenges I have to emphasize it once again is the trade-off between ecological validity, authentic settings, and statistical or experimental robustness. That's a big issue, and I think we have to find compromises, or we have to find interfaces in order to combine both. Another challenge to the field is, in fact, digitization. I mentioned machine translation. The modeling of machine translated processes or post-editing of machine translation is a big issue as well. And again, if we talk about interfacing written and oral translation, again, in subtitling, for example, we do not only have machine translation, but also automatic speech recognition. So here again, other kinds of artificial intelligence or machine learning strategies become very important for the translation profession and for translation research.
Fantastic. And let me take a step back here and let's think a little bit about the forest behind the trees, to put it that way, right? So beyond universals in particular, what is your take on the status of cognitive translation and interpreting studies nowadays? It's a field that is relatively young, even in comparison to translation and interpreting studies as a whole, right? A number of different branches or sub-trends have emerged with different degrees of, let's say, robustness and international representation and so on and so forth. So what is your take on the strong and the weak points characterizing our field nowadays, and where do you see us going in the next maybe 10 or 20 years?
Yeah, I think the strong points are that we learned to adapt methods from other disciplines. For instance, computational methods, statistical methods, but also methods from cognitive science. So we learned a lot about these interdisciplinary approaches, which helped us a lot with our research. The problem is, however, that we are not we are not really interdisciplinary. I mean, we can learn a lot from bilingualism research, but we do not interact with this kind of research branch. And I would like to see joint conferences, joint papers with people from neuroscientific bilingualism research. I would like to see joint papers with people from computational linguistics. Yeah, this would be real life interdisciplinary research, and not only adapting methods. So yeah.
So basically, yeah, I think I share your view. I mean, there's been a lot of importing, right? It's like we've borrowed a lot from many different fields. But maybe the give and take is not so bidirectional as one would hope, right?
Exactly, because I think they can learn a lot from our kind of research. Sure. For example, taking translation expertise into account, taking the importance of text types into account, stuff like this. And I think there should be a bidirectional way of borrowing research methods, but also research contents, in fact.
Definitely. One final question, Silvia, and again, from a perspective stance, what would you tell someone who is interested in joining this world, someone who has an interest in translation and would like to perhaps pursue a career in researching translation, and in particular, perhaps from a cognitive stance? What would your words of wisdom for this person be?
Oh, that's a
no pressure.
No pressure. This person should have. I think this person should be curious about a lot of things. Curious about research questions, working on old research questions, but also developing new research questions on this basis. He or she should be curious about testing methods and combining methods, and he or she should be very curious about learning new stuff from our own discipline, but also from other disciplines. I mentioned that before. Some other important things would be to do intersubjective research. So we shouldn't do subjectively oriented research, especially when we talk about quality. We should do replicable research and transparent research, which can be retested and reworked on and reinterpreted. And maybe we can solve the above mentioned trade-off between experimental clearness and authentic translation corpora. Yeah, that would be my my 3 or 4 words to say.
Fantastic. I think that is as imposing as it is encouraging. So hopefully we will have new generations of interdisciplinary scholars joining these lines of work, and surely those people will have a lot to learn from the contributions that you and your team are continually making. So thank you for that, Silvia, and thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure to have you here on Minds Between Languages, and we will be looking forward to further occasions of discussing these interesting things with you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Fantastic. Till next time, Silvia. Thanks.